Hi, I'm Olivia B. This is another video in the Blackbird Designs Quilt Along series. If this is the first one you're seeing, we're doing a quilt along using Blackbird Designs quilt patterns and mainly focusing on hand applique. We is myself and Lori from Textilist. Lori has some great videos up on her channel in relation to applique and the quilt along, so please check her out. This video is going to focus on how I use the Apliquick method to do my applique. Before I dive into that though, I just had a few things I wanted to talk about. Since I did my last video, Barb Adams of Blackbird Designs passed away. I don't think a lot of us saw that coming, and it's been quite a blow to the community. We all loved her and her work very much. I just want to say that there may be those of you who are watching this video who are friends with Barb, who are close with her, and I wanted you to know that I'm thinking about you during this time, and I'm very sorry for your loss. I'm really sorry for all of us in the community as well. All of us, we greatly admired Barb. We're all big Blackbird Designs fans. I imagine that's one of the reasons you're here watching this video. And, she was an amazing woman. And I was talking to my friends, Maddie and Michelle, just about on the day that we found out, just about what she meant to all, what Blackbird Designs means to us and how we were feeling and how it's kind of hard to explain to people outside of the community. And Maddie has a way with words, and I asked her if I could share this. This was just a message that she sent over chat. She's Wellington Prims on Instagram. You should check her out. But this is what Maddie said, and I thought it was just, it kind of took what we were feeling and put it in words well. She said, "They shared stories of their life and they poured parts of themselves into their designs. So even if you never met them in person, they were still a part of your life and they still felt familiar. It's not just mourning the actual person, it's mourning the era of being excited for their releases, the anticipation of meeting them at a retreat, and the collective love and admiration for their patterns. If there's any comfort in death, it's leaving behind a legacy and knowing that you brought people joy and happiness. And she definitely did that for a lot more people than she probably ever realized." And I think that's very well said. My friends Maddie and Michelle, they have... I always loved Blackbird Designs. One of the first patterns I bought from, first time I bought paper patterns from my LNS, Needle in a Haystack, and one of those first designs was on the Long and Winding Road by Blackbird Designs. And I always enjoyed Blackbird Designs. My friends Maddie and Michelle really are, they're super fans, and they really spurred me on in that love. And we had a chance to meet Barb and Alma at a retreat at the Attic in 2018. And they were both very nice ladies. Anyway, I just wanted to touch on that because, it's a big hit to our community that happened recently, and this is the Blackbird Designs Quilt Along. And I feel like it takes on kind of for me at least, a more special meaning because it feels more like a tribute. So I'll be remembering Barb, and I'll be thinking of Alma as I'm working on my projects. The next thing I wanted to mention was I just wanted to give a shout out to a couple of lovely ladies, floss tubers that I admire that have contributed to the Blackbird Designs Quilt Along, and that I greatly appreciate. First, Carol Saltboxstitcher did an amazing video where she showed her huge collection of Blackbird Designs books and so many of the quilts that were in those books, and that video was epic. I had not seen ever some of those patterns, many of them. And to, I know Carol's a huge fan and has been for a very long time, and she was able to share some of the history of the Blackbird Designs and how they played a part in her life and showed some of her projects. And I know that couldn't have been an easy video to make. That was a lot of work. So also a shout out to her husband. So a big thank you to Carol for that. And I just got done watching Susan Stanley's video. That woman is a gift to us. She is very into history, as it relates to textiles especially. And she talked about applique, and she is a gifted applique quilter. And it was great to learn more about the history, to see applique, hand applique from different countries and throughout history. So a huge shout out to Susan. I'm very thankful to her for making that video. All right, so let's get into the video. Let's get into the applique. My previous video was focused on the tools that I use for my hand applique. I use the Apliquick method. I encourage you, if you're interested in it, to look it up. It's just one P in the word. I'll put it on screen so you know how to spell it. There are tutorials out there on how to do it. What I'm about to show you, I would call less a tutorial and more a look into how someone who is new to hand applique works through the process. I'll show you how I do my hand applique, or actually no, in this video what I'll do is I'll show you how I prepare the pieces using the Apliquick tools. The next video after this one that I'll make is how I do the actual hand applique, so how I sew them on. In the Apliquick method, you prepare your pieces and turn the edges ahead of time, and then you go and you simply sew them on, versus a method like needle turn where you spend very little time preparing your pieces, and then you spend a little more time turning the edges under while you're sewing them on. As Susan Stanley wisely pointed out in her video, there is no quick applique method. This is, I call this slow stitching. That's part of the reason I enjoy it personally. So I'm going to show you how I do it. Again, this is using the tools. So there is an investment required in order to get these tools. There's an investment in this process. I tend to be kind of a tools person. I'm more of a tools person than an accessories person. So if you were to come to my sewing area, you would find tools but less cute things. So I chose to invest in these tools. I am very thankful that I did. I really enjoy using them, but you can totally do applique without them. This method requires the tools, but you could maybe look at this method and find ways around it to do it in a less expensive way so that you don't have to buy the tools. Or I would also highly encourage you to check out Jan Paddock's video tutorials on needle turn applique. That requires very few purchases, and obviously, just watch Susan's video about the history. People did this with no tools. They just had a needle and thread and some fabric. So you don't need these tools. But if you're interested to see how they are used and how this method works, I've made a video for you so that you can see how that's done. As usual, I would ask that if you have any advice or feedback you'd like to give, I'd love to hear about in the comments. And of course, if you have any questions at all, please put them in the comments. I'll also put my email address on screen. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Even if you have a question that's not so much quilting related, but say you would like to share the work that you're doing or have done in the past, and you're having trouble figuring out how to do that through, say, Instagram or YouTube, shoot me an email, and if it's something that I can figure out and can figure out how to help you, I would be happy to do that. As far as the project that I'm going to start this quilt along with, I do have a quilt in progress called Midnight Silhouette Quilt that I've shown in previous videos. So I do count that as part of the quilt along, but I'm close to being done with the applique, which is exciting. But for the purposes of the quilt along and for this video, I've decided that my first project is actually just going to be a block that I will use in making a project bag. So I have chosen a block from this book, Fresh Picked, and there is a quilt in this book called Farmer's Market. It's very cute, and its blocks finish at 9 inches, so they're pretty small for applique blocks for Blackbird Designs. So when I make a project bag, the front of the project bag is bigger than 9 inches, so my plan is to make this block, and then I will add, piecing around it. Maybe it's just some scraps, something simple. But this is the block that I'm going to be using. It's called Bluebird. And so I'm going to walk you through the process of preparing the pieces for this block. All right, so here's the pattern I'm going to use. And on my right here, I have the templates for myself to trace. One of the things I really like about Blackbird Designs applique patterns is that they put all of the pieces fully on the page rather than, overlapping them and saying attached to page 2. They put them all on one page, they space them out, they don't layer them on top of each other. You can work with both of those things. This just makes it very nice and clean and easy. For this pattern, I'm going to make it a little easier on myself, and instead of making these leaves two-tone and making them each out of 2 pieces, I'm just going to trace them and make them 1 piece each. So the first step in the Apliquick process is to trace your templates onto the Apliquick paper. So I'm going to take my Apliquick paper and I'm going to do it shiny side up because that's the glue side. I'll lay it over my pieces. I like to try to get them close together so I save paper. I use a pencil. This is just a regular pencil. Like I mentioned in my tools video, you could use like a Sharpie and that would have a finer tip. Just be aware it's going to bleed through. In this case, I don't want to ruin the book. What I could do is make a photocopy of the page and trace the templates that way. But I'm okay with using a pencil because these aren't tiny pieces. They're not super specific, and I don't need a super fine line. This piece is labeled B, so I'm going to go ahead and write that on there too. There's also a line on this. You don't always see these, but this is an overlap line. And that line is going to help me in placement. So I'm going to go ahead and trace that onto here too. This is a line that I will be cutting out on. I won't be adding the seam allowance when I'm cutting out the shape from the paper. I'll be adding that in on the fabric. On the J piece, it says cut 3, so I'm going to circle that one, or trace that one 3 times. On this piece here, the instructions say cut 1 and 1 reverse. That's because we're going to be using this leaf twice. Again, one in this shape and one in the reverse shape. So all I do is flip over my paper and draw on the other side. I'll be able to see the paper lines through, and I can also just flip it over when I'm cutting them out. Okay, now I've traced all of my pieces. I have them labeled so I know the letters that each one has, and I've also marked my overlap lines where necessary. I've paid attention to the numbers of how many it says to cut, and also included the reverse where I need it to. So my next step now is basically simple kindergarten crafts. I'm just going to cut these out on the drawn lines. I'm going to use my Apliquick scissors to do this, but obviously you can use any scissors you like. Sometimes when there's smaller pieces, like these circles, I'll just cut out the chunk that they take place on, that they're placed on. and that lets me get up close and personal with them. Now I just loosely traced these circles. You know, it's just the kind of the style of the piece that I don't think they need to be super exact, but there are definitely pieces where you would want a perfect circle. And in that case, it might be useful to have some kind of stencil. Okay, so now I've got all of my pieces cut out. I just want to point out that because you're able to draw and trace on the glue side of the paper with the Apliquick paper, this is exactly what it's going to look like on the fabric. In other words, the orientation. So when I go to sew my pieces on, this bird will actually be facing this way. It won't be reversed. So, you know, if you just pay attention to that. Sometimes the book will reverse it for you because it's written in it for a different method, and you'll have to reverse it back. But basically, what's easy about this is that you can already envision what it's going to look like. So if you're looking at the picture and the bird is facing the other way, then you know you have to flip over your paper and trace it that way onto the glue side. So now that I've got all of my pieces cut out, the next step is to iron them onto my fabric. Alright, so my next step is going to be ironing my shapes onto my fabrics. I just went through my scraps and found some smaller pieces of fabric that are, you know, similar to what you see in the picture. They've got this cute, you know, different colored leaf thing going on, and as I showed you when I was tracing them, I'm going to do the leaves as just one piece each instead of two, but I have a few different greens here, and I have, you know, like a pink red color for the berries and then two light blues for the bird. And then I'm just going to use my shapes and figure out how I want to best do it. So let's first go with the berries. I'm going to take this red piece of fabric. I like to give my fabric a press before I do this, which I've already done. So now I take my shapes, in this case the berries, and I'm going to lay them out on the fabric. And I want to make sure that I have room around them. I'm doing glue side down, so the shiny side of the paper down. And I'm leaving enough room around the berries so that I can cut between an 1/8 to a 1/4 inch around each of them. So for example, here's 2 berries. I'm going to need a seam allowance for each of them, so I want to make sure there's enough space there. So that works for me. So I've got my iron set on my cotton setting, which I use to press my fabric, and I have no steam. I don't have any clear instructions on the Apliquick paper and how you're supposed to press it on. This is just how I do it, and it works. So I just press it on there for a few seconds. And that's it. They're on there. I could go a little longer if I wanted to, or not. I could flip it. But those are ready to cut out. So I'm going to do the rest of them. Okay, now I have all of my pieces pressed, all of my papers pressed down onto my fabrics, and now my next step is cutting them all out. Okay, so when I'm cutting out my pieces, again, I want to leave between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch around the entire piece. If you need an exact number, I'd say 3/16 of an inch, but I just kind of eyeball it and proceed to cut around it. Okay, so now I've cut out my shapes, but there's another key part in the cutting process. So when we, after we cut these out, and we're going to use the Apliquick tools and glue to turn the fabric over the paper and to fold it all in. So as you can imagine, when you have a curve like this, that fabric is not going to easily come over because it's going to be stretched too tight. So that means you need to do some clipping. So everywhere where the fabric, where you've got an inside curve like this, you're going to clip your fabric up very close to the paper, maybe a thread or two away. Okay, so I've got that cut there. Places like this. And this is a subtle curve, but I still find it helpful to clip it a bit. It makes it easier when I turn it in. So I try to do that for all of my pieces before I get to the turning stage, but when I'm doing the turning, usually what I'll do is I'll keep the scissors handy because sometimes I'll come across a spot that I hadn't thought to cut before, or I just forgotten. Okay, so the next step is involves taking out the glue and the Apliquick tools and turning the edges over. All right, so next up is turning the edges of our applique pieces. You can learn more about the tools that I use in the video that I posted about my Apliquick tools and what I use to do my applique. I'm using a Sewline fabric glue here that's blue, so you'll be able to see it. And these are my Apliquick tools that I use for turning. So what I do is I just do a little bit of glue at a time. It dries fairly quickly and I'm a little slow, so I just kind of go in sections. So I run the glue on the area where the paper and the fabric meet. And so I hold down my piece with this forked end, and I use the beveled end to turn the fabric over. And because the fusible paper that I've applied is pretty firm, it just smooths over easily. One of the reasons I'm probably pretty slow is because I take the time to do this with the glue, a little bit at a time. Some pieces and some area of the pieces go quicker and easier than others. For example, this has got a point at the end. And I always find these areas a little more challenging. I just use my glue. Sometimes I'll take the tip of the beveled end and I'll just kind of mark here, like a little in the fabric where my bend mark is going to be. And then I fold it over. When you're working with smaller pieces, it can help to use the other ends, which are these pointier pieces. It can also help, I find, with just like little threads that you have to tuck in. I just want to make sure everything is tucked in on the underside of this. It can be a little, you know, messy or unattractive around here if I need it to be, as long as it doesn't show up on the front. So here I've got a bit of a more curve to this piece. It's an outward curve. And so you're going to have some little pleats in here. When I have a rounded curve and I'm going to have pleats, instead of trying to flatten it as I go around, I'll kind of go around and secure it down like this. And then I'll go back and press flat. That kind of distributes the fabric a little more evenly and makes the piece flatter. So if I turn it over, I can see what it's going to look like. And there you go, it looks pretty smooth. Now, as the glue dries, it's not so thick or firm that I can't adjust this. So if I wanted to, I could take my little points, and trust me, I've done this. And I could peel the fabric back, and, you know, kind of straighten it, put some more glue on, and press it down again. You know, it can fray the fabric a little bit when you do that, so you don't want to have to do it a million times. But you can be as perfect and precise as you want to be with these things. So I've got one leaf. Let's do a berry, just because a full circle could be maybe a little more challenging. So I'm just going to go, it's a pretty small piece, so I'm just going to go ahead all around. Luckily, Blackbird Designs doesn't do a lot of tiny pieces, but if I have seen these tools used for a lot of very small pieces, especially in kind of Spanish and Japanese are two Aplique. Those are countries I've seen some really cool applique pieces from. And a lot of them seem to like favorite tiny applique pieces, and a lot of people use these for the tiny applique. And I mean, you can get really precise with these little points here. I think really one of the keys here is the paper. It's just kind of got just the right firmness to be able to turn the edges, but to also sew through. You can see this is all pleats, so I try to go a little bit ahead and press it down and then go back so that I can evenly distribute it and flatten it. And then I'll go back and use the beveled edge to flatten it even more. And if you needed it really flat, you could flip it over and press it. So there's my not exactly round circle. If I had used a round stencil, I would have cut out the paper perfectly round, and then I would have been able to make a perfectly round applique. But for a Blackbird design berry, I'm good with this. So now I'm going to go through and turn the edges on all of my pieces. All right, so there we go. I have all of my pieces turned. The edges are turned under now, and those are ready to sew on to my background. The final element I need for this block are the bias stems. So I'll need to make those. I need to make those on the bias so that they're able to curve and I can kind of form them to the design. Alright, so here's the fabric that I'm going to use for my stems, and I need to make some bias tape out of it. The pattern calls for 1/4 inch bias tape, and I'm going to show you the way that I make it using the instructions or the method that they use in the Blackbird design books. They have you use a Clover bias tape maker, so that's what I'm going to use. And they'll tell you how much yardage to make of the stems for whatever you're making. So for example, for this small block I'm making, the quilt that it's for actually calls for 2 of the same block, so they give me the amount I need for those 2 blocks, which is I believe 1.25 yards. So I am going to make that much. I'm making 1 block here, but it's nice to have some extra. So I'm actually just going to cut a few strips. This is what the Clover bias tape maker looks like for the 1/4 inch. And it requires that you cut strips on the bias that are 1/2 inch wide. The bias is the diagonal run of the fabric. It's the stretchiest part. And the reason you need to make the tape for the stems on the stretchiest part is that you'll need to make them curve a bit. So if we were doing all straight stems, then you could probably just, you know, cut along the length of the fabric. But in this case, we have to do the bias. You know, this is not the easiest part for me. I would highly recommend watching or reading a tutorial on making bias tape with this method. But I kind of wanted to show you, you know, if you're a beginner, and I just wanted to show you how I started out and how I've been making it. I've only made bias tape for 1 quilt so far, so I'm still learning, and you know, but sometimes learning together is a little easier. So I've already trimmed my edges on this fabric. I gave it a light press. You can still, it's still a little wrinkled, but not too bad. I have a Creative Grids ruler here. Doesn't matter what ruler you use, but you do need a 45-degree angle line. So you can see that black line there. And what I do is I match it up to that clean edge of my fabric. There we go. Now I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and cut a strip off. This is a beautiful Paula Barnes fabric. Kind of a brown green color. I think will go well for Blackbird. So now I have a 45-degree angle cut, which means I am perfectly on the bias there. And then I can just take my ruler and start cutting 1/2 inch wide strips. So I've got a bunch of strips here. These are all 1/2 inch wide and cut on the bias and ready to run through the bias tape maker. I just wanted to point out I should have cut the selvage off first. So now I'm gonna have to go and just trim those off. Not a big deal, but definitely do that first. All right, so now it's time to run our fabric through the bias tape maker. I like to spritz mine a bit with Best Press first. You take this side with the number on it. Sorry if you can hear my dog panting in the background. And you're going to run. It's great if you have like a diagonal end like this to help poke it through. You're going to run the fabric with the right side up into this and use something as tip. You could even use a needle and just run it through like that until you get this part out. And then you're going to flip it over. You can do this however you want. I like to put a needle right here. See if that'll work on this mat. Got my iron just set at my usual cotton setting. You can hear it sizzle from the Best Press. Well, actually, it's this caddy mat. It is the reason you're hearing so much sizzle because the droplets are on it. You won't usually hear that much with your bias, but so I just kind of push it like that. You kind of have to keep it straight here at the back. So maybe guide it a little. And there you go. I'll give an extra little press there. Now I've got a stem that is a 1/4 inch wide with the sides turned under. All right, so now I have several stems that I've made. I probably won't need this much for the block, but I will keep the others on hand for other projects. One challenge I've run into on the quilt that I'm doing, the borders have long vines, so you have to make them out of several strips, meaning you cut several strips and you sew them together on a diagonal, and then you run them through the bias tape maker. The problem I've had is that the seams seem to get stuck. So the places where I've sewn the 2 strips together get lodged in the bias tape maker as I'm pulling them through, and they don't come through smoothly. So I often have to struggle with them, and it'll make it so that it opens up at that seam, and the edges aren't curved nicely under. I'm also kind of distorting the fabric a bit because I'm stretching it as I'm pulling it through. I'm just putting that out there in case anyone out there has any advice. I'm wondering, do you do yours when you have to do a long vine? If you had to do that before, do you do it in strips like this and then just turn in these end edges and sew the 2 strips next to each other? Or do you have any tips for making long bias tape? Love to hear about it. Anyway, if you have any questions about preparing your pieces for applique the way that I've done it, or any feedback, any advice that you'd like to contribute, please put it down below in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Again, let me know if you have any questions or any feedback. The next video that I plan on posting will be how I sew the pieces onto the block or the quilt or whatever I'm sewing them onto. That should be, I wanted to make it a separate video because that doesn't require Apliquick tools. So if you were preparing your pieces, say using the method that Lori showed in her tutorial with the freezer paper, this would be kind of the next step after that video as well. So that's the next video I'll post. And then I do have a few more Blackbird Designs books that I'd like to show you and flip through. Many of you said that you'd like to see out of print books. I have a few, not a ton, but I hope you saw Lori's video where she did project by project flip throughs of her books. She showed a lot of great ones in there. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope that you will join in the quilt along and post pictures on Instagram and tag them BBD QAL, or if you're just interested in looking at what other people have posted, you can search for that hashtag. Thanks a lot.